Welcome to Leaders and Legends, the podcast focused on leadership and clinical trial execution. I'm your host, Patty Lushton, CEO of Diligent Pharma. In each episode, we'll get to know the individuals who are driving change and influencing the direction of our industry. Whether you're a seasoned executive yourself, an emerging leader, or simply passionate about clinical trials like I am, join us as we discuss our industry's most pressing challenges, the future of clinical trials, and hear insights and advice from the leaders who are moving our industry forward. Roy, it's such an honor to have you as part of our podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, Roy, as I've been sort of reflecting on some of the conversations that you and I have had and preparing for this discussion today, something struck me that there's been a consistent theme, I think, in your career journey of attracting great people, building winning teams, and having repeatable success. And I want to explore a lot of that today as part of our discussion. But first, I was wondering if you could just share, how did you find yourself in the pharmaceutical industry? What inspired you to join the pharma industry?
Yeah, well, a fairly long-winded answer to that. From a very early age, I really did want to be a physician and really structured everything I did towards achieving that goal. My career really spanned two really demanding worlds, and I've tried to navigate both of those, to the best of my ability. The first was obviously academic medicine. And in this regard, I trained as a physician scientist in general medicine, hematology, oncology, and stem cell transplantation, and then spent roughly a quarter of a century in academic medicine in roles of fundamental research, clinical practice, and administration and teaching. But early in this endeavor, I was driven by the idea of trying to do something important in medicine. And that found expression in trying to bring forward innovative medicines or treatment strategies that might help patients. My final academic position was as endowed chair at Karmanos Cancer Institute in Detroit, where I was also professor of medicine and oncology. After rising through the leadership ranks in academics, it became very clear to me, however, that industry really was in many ways best configured to advance breakthrough medicines and first-in-class medicines for the benefit of patients. So with that, I moved to industry and have spent another quarter of a century helping develop medicine. Many of these have changed clinical practice. I went on to hold leadership positions with Amgen and Gilead and Merck. And that latter position I served for about a decade as head of worldwide clinical development, and for the latter half of it as chief medical officer. Eventually, I formally retired from Merck, but immediately stepped back into another operating role at another company, a startup company. And so pretty much there has not been a single moment along this journey. It's really been a very consistent goal of trying to make a difference for patients. While titles may have changed, institutions may have changed, the conviction really never changed. And importantly, in any of these roles, I never actually walked into a well-established entity. All of these are to rebuild or turn around. I think there's a little bit of an entrepreneurial spirit that also went along with it.
Yeah. Well, I know there's many people who are very grateful that you had that insight to join the pharma industry. And, you mentioned Merck, and I want to talk about that for a bit. And am I correct in saying that under your leadership, 140 medicines and vaccines were approved during your time there? Is that right?
So there were a total of 26 new molecular entities, but there were well north of 100, and I think the number is around 150 indications for those medicines. But There were a total of 26 new molecular entities during that time.
And that's amazing. And, I mentioned earlier this idea of just repeatable success and consistency. And, if you were asked to write the Roy Baynes playbook on how you've done this just so repeatedly in developing transformational medicines, what would some of the key principles in that playbook be, Roy?
Well, they're easy to say and hard to do. So I think
I'm sure.
the first key principle really derives from a concept that one of the early CEOs at Merck, George Merck, always articulated. He stated that medicine is for patients, not for profits. And when we've remembered that, the profits have never failed to appear. And here I'm using profits as a proxy for clinical benefit. So I've had the good fortune and great privilege to lead many first-in-class programs that did make a difference for patients. The key principles, though, are always the same. It's a team sport. You have to build the best teams. And we could get into some detail around that, but essentially, hiring the best talent, retaining the best talent, operating in a very clear business model with a very clear organizational construct, with optimal and nimble governance and robust tools and systems. So that's all the concepts of building and enabling the teams. Then you have to chart a course. And by that I mean you have to put a thoughtful, actionable strategy in place for development of the drug, mindful of regulatory precedent. You also have to be able to articulate the value proposition for that medicine, and ultimately, this becomes the basis of commercialization. Then once you develop that strategy, you've got to deliver results. And ultimately, it's all about execution. The world is full of smart people. And
Right.
execution, all you've got is a whole lot of smart people. So you really do have to execute. And then we never forget that we operate in a regulated environment, and so consequently, ultimate respect for compliance is essential.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, because a collection of, subject matter experts and intelligent people isn't going to necessarily equate with success. So what does distinguish these teams, and what are some of the cultural characteristics that you've instilled along the way?
Yeah, well, I think that there are many, many components to that, but maybe I can just highlight what I think are a couple of the key ones. So ultimately, as I said earlier, you've got to build the very best teams, and they have to embrace the notion of what you're doing is a noble cause. Remember, patients are at the base of everything we do. You have to conspicuous excellence and deep functional excellence. Very hard for on-the-job learning in any of these roles. And as I said earlier, you have to provide organizational clarity and consistent direction and messaging. You can't be changing direction every day. People have to know, what they're trying to accomplish. It's important it has always been important for myself, but also for all leaders I hire, that they try and provide inspirational leadership. People want to work for inspirational people, and they want to work for optimists. And typically, the truism in any walk of life, that essentially A's don't work for B's. So you've got to try and make sure you've got A's in the leadership position. You have to provide a very clear and simple operating model. The more complicated that operating model, the less likely you are going to succeed. I have a particular set of pet aspects which I always try and drive home, and that is you have to eschew consultants. You don't need management consultants. You know your business better than them.
Mm.
Got to eschew distractions. And another one that I really, in our business, have very hard at is really getting rid of business outsourcing. Because I think that people then forget how to actually do the job. They managers vendors rather than actually doing the job. I've always wanted to try and avoid matrix management and keeping infrastructure very simple. Rapid decision-making. As I mentioned, you have to develop actionable strategy and tactics. You've got to hold folk accountable and at the same time deliver results in a framework of compliance. And one of the great messages that one of my mentors gave me early on is always try and be a role model, because typically those A's will want to work for a role model, and that helps build the infrastructure.
Yes, and you said something so important about having a noble cause, and we're doing such important work in this industry where patients are really at the center. And I do think that sometimes in the day-to-day, like busyness, I guess, of clinical trial execution, it does sometimes get lost of why we're all doing this, right? And so it sounds like it's been very intentional that you have always brought that back as sort of a North Star. Is that fair to say?
I think I've had the great privilege of every organization I've worked at has embraced that mission. These are easy platitudes to make, but I think when you see organizations and companies that really live the mission, it becomes actually pretty ingrained in the culture of the company. And the more you see that, the more this speaks to it being a noble cause.
Mm-hmm. I've never heard that before. A's don't work for B's. Maybe that's a common phrase, but I think that's a principle that, so you're hiring top notch leaders, and some of them, of course, I know and admire as well, people like Andy Lee and Kevin O'Brien and Adrian Atta. And it seems like you've really had a gift in attracting these individuals, and they follow you, right? You work with people in multiple organizations, and so what do you think that what is at the heart of that? Is it the relationships that you form with your leaders, or talk about that a little bit?
Well, again, leadership is a team sport, and so I've had the very great privilege of, for the last quarter of a century, pretty much working continuously with Roger Perlmutter. And, many other members of our current and prior leadership teams had worked together for a long period. So I've never seen this as a sort of one-man show. It's you need all the components to be aligned. You can have great debates behind closed doors, but you should always have no white space between your leaders. And when groups recognize that there is solidarity of purpose, commitment to the cause, and at the same time in a rigorous scientific framework, that typically attracts people. And so I do think that management is also a team sport.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, when we spoke, you talked about your tour of duty with Roger, and what about that relationship has endured? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think Roger is a pretty remarkable individual, and in many ways he is a polymath. He has remarkable integrity. He is honest as the day is long. He is kind, and he's inspirational. It's very usual that in any meeting you're in, Roger generally knows more about the subject matter than any of the experts. And so that way, it is just such an inspirational environment, and he is such an inspirational leader to be around. There's not a day goes by that I don't learn something from him.
That's amazing, and what an amazing opportunity, not only for you but for all the other individuals that are working with Roger. Do you mind talking a little bit about Keytruda? I want to ask a few questions, and I was imagining that at this stage you might be sort of tired of all the questions about the amazing success with Keytruda. But I guess, what I was wondering is at the time there were a number of PD-1 inhibitors that were under development. There were other companies doing this work. What was it about Keytruda that was different? Was it the science? Was it the execution? What was the differentiator there?
Yeah, the answer there is both complex and simple. So I think the story that I will try and outline exemplifies some of the ideas of, medicine being for patients, building best teams, charting the course, and delivering results. Merck in the 90s was the premier research-intensive biopharmaceutical entity. Many of the concepts of GXP were invented by Merck. It was the shining light in drug development. During the first decade of this century, it lost its way, and this resulted in diminution of value for the company, multiple late-stage failures, and at one point didn't know what the way back was. Ken Frazier took over as the CEO, recruited Roger for a second tour of duty to Merck, and that started in 2013. The company really had to find a way out of the mess. This started when Roger really spotted Keytruda as being a really, really important molecule. By way of history, this molecule had come in via the Schering-Plough acquisition in 2008-9, and after that, after they had acquired it from Organon. Unfortunately, when it first came in, it lay on the shelf for several years and indeed was on the out-licensing block for a period of time.
Wow, I didn't realize that. That's incredible.
In 2011, management at the time had an epiphany that this might be an important molecule. And Eric Rubin in the oncology group started a phase 1 program. Initially in patients with melanoma as an immunoresponsive disease, and then subsequently in the same phase 1 study looked at biomarker-selected lung cancer patients. At that time, the molecule was nearly 4 years behind BMS, Volumab. Eric led this phase 1 program that became an adaptive phase 1 study which grew from 30 patients to 1,200 patients. So what he did was do adaptive cohort additions while still maintaining very tight type 1 error control, and was able to really move very quickly in this very innovative trial design. At ASCO in 2013, Roger met with me and shared the lung data. And he was convinced this was going to be a really important drug. And I must say, as I looked at it, I thought he was probably right. He was also particularly interested in combinations that would enhance antigenic cell death, that is to say, death of the cancer cell, thereby creating additional antigens for immune response. At the time, this was seen as an heretical view. In fact, everyone believed the way forward was to combine immunologically active drugs, and that it could make chemo, history.
Interesting.
It was clear to be successful in this effort, and for Merck to be successful, really there was going to need to be an industrial strength program. However, Roger was facing the challenge of an organization that had lost its way, and it was not configured to win. I shared his excitement and ultimately joined Merck also in 2013, later in the year, very much encouraged by his exhortation to help restore Merck, the once iconic biopharmaceutical company, to its former greatness. The issues actually transcended oncology. They were applicable writ large across all of the therapeutic areas. In parallel, we had to rebuild the development capability for the company. and at the same time advance the development of Keytruda. And these two priorities were ultimately intimately intertwined. And what this involved was using all of the tools in the toolbox to restore Merck clinical research to its rightful place as the best research-intensive biopharmaceutical entity, and to seize the opportunity that Keytruda presented for the company. So to do that, we had to follow the principle, build the best teams. As I mentioned earlier, this is a team competed at the best. Eric Rubin, I've highlighted already. Ray Baynes was our head of quantitative sciences and biostatistics, and he refreshed that whole branch of the company, really built so that we could operate at scale. We brought Andy in, and Andy first the programmatic outsourcing quagmire that Merck had gotten itself into, and pretty much completely rebuilt clinical operations. We internalized virtually all the capabilities, supplemented where necessary with FSPs, functional service providers, and this allowed us to operate again at scale. We brought in Roger Dancy, who's a seasoned late-stage development professional, and he was brought in to lead the oncology effort. Emmett Schmidt, who is unfortunately now deceased, in addition to lead extramural collaboration, the efficient and cost-effective way of doing signal detection. We brought in Bill Aurora, a seasoned medical affairs lead, to revamp medical affairs. That work was ultimately completed by Eliev Barr, who also was identified as my successor for when I retired, because Roger and I were pretty far along in our careers when we came in, and succession planning was really important. There's Sean Curtis in the regulatory lead position. And then we had an enormous recruiting effort where we literally brought in hundreds of oncologists, brought in thousands of operational people, and we strengthened the regulatory. We also changed the operating model to a lean product development team. Instead of having a cast of hundreds, it was literally a very small unit of execution. And then we simplified governance. Fortunately, Eric Rubin had been prescient in that once he started to see a signal in the melanoma group, he said, we need to rapidly do signal detection to see where else the drug might play. And so they started a series of parsimonious basket trials. They argued that if the was going to work, it would be in those patients that had a lot of the ligand PD-L1, because that's how it's thought to work. PD-L1 binds to PD-1 and suppresses the immune response. If you can prevent that, you might reveal the immune response. And in addition, there was a belief that cancers that had a high mutational rate would also have a high rate of exhibition of what are called neoantigens. So we did these basket trials in PD-L1 high tumors or highly mutated tumors or both. We looked at 30 major cancer types, and guess what? The vast majority showed dramatic responses.
Which is just amazing. And I mean, I didn't realize that you were sort of revamping your development capability in tandem with getting this program off the ground. I mean, that is really tremendous.
We had to, because frankly, the way it was configured, it could never have operated at scale. And frankly, we had to do all of this to improve quality of the operation, as well as scalability of the operation.
Well, what is also incredibly, just impressive is that Keytruda reached patients in kind of record time, right? So, and you were able to do this without compromising quality or the scientific rigor. And I mean, now that we're talking about it, I actually do have the chills, Roy, it's kind of such an incredible achievement. So the Keytruda story is just incredible. And I'm going to ask a question that might be a tough question to answer, but I mean, drug development there's so much uncertainty, and it really sometimes comes down to decision making, right? Making the right decisions at the right time. And so as a development leader, how do you know like when to double down on a program versus when to pause or change course? What are some of the signals for that?
So I think at least a truism, at least from what I've seen, is that you have to follow the science. You have to fully utilize the quantitative sciences, and the whole world of artificial intelligence, big data, and data analysis really helps you, I think, figure out, is there something here or not? So that's an important part. You have to understand regulatory precedent. So you can have a great signal, but if there's no pathway forward, trying to build a new indication or a new regulatory pathway is a pretty daunting task. And so understanding precedent is important. I think, and it sounds trite, but you really must focus on drugs that have unambiguously large effect sizes for their stage of development. And typically, I've always believed that first-in-class molecules are also worth putting a lot of effort into.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of this, I think, is you have to avoid franchise thinking. And by that, I mean this notion that if you have a great drug, it will build a great franchise. I mean, Keytruda is a great case in point. Merck was not an oncology company of any note. Keytruda came along. It really did fantastically, in clinical research, and it built a great franchise. Today, the Keytruda franchise is, I think, the single biggest drug by sales in the world today. But you've got to avoid the franchise thinking. You have to realize that great franchises don't always build great drugs. And so really let the drug lead you rather than the business aspect.
Yeah. Well, it also comes back to what you said almost, immediately into this conversation, that if you focus on the patients, then the profits will follow, right? I think it's very connected to that.
Absolutely. The other comment about doubling down is make phase appropriate decisions. So a striking signal in phase 1 is very different from a striking signal in phase 3. And as the further along you get, the more appropriate it is to double down. You do have to embrace risk. One of my ex-CEOs, Keytruda at Amgen, used to say to us, you have to bet your job every day. So, you do have to take risk.
Mm-hmm.
And then one area that really can never be, I think, overstated is the importance of good fortune. So I think these are all components. You follow the science, phase appropriate investment, take appropriate risk, and then thank goodness for fortune.
Mm. As we're talking, I'm really thinking about drug development as a very complex art in a way. It brings together so many different components and disciplines. And, I just wonder if you have a perspective on where we are today as an industry and just with, the talent that is, available to us and with the technology that is at our fingertips with AI. What's your perspective, given that you've done this for so many years and can we apply some of those same principles today that you did all those years ago at Merck?
Yes, and I think our discipline has evolved significantly. So I think you've touched on a few of these. The improvement in diagnostics has been phenomenal. So getting the diagnosis right has become a lot more achievable. Our ability to profile the biology of individual patients has become much more well established. This has allowed us to really apply precision medicine for patient selection. And in addition, and this is probably the most important, the therapeutics we're working on today tend to be really active drugs. So quality and the measurability of responses has become much more defined. I can tell you that in the early days of oncology drug development, we would oftentimes get excited if we saw a single response to a new medicine. Today, that would be somewhat passe. We're looking for big numbers of responses across populations. So I think that I believe that we will continue to see the field evolving. I do think quantitative sciences and AI are also helping. And I think what we will see is we will get ever more precise medicine. We'll have ever better, finely calibrated benefit risk understanding. And I think ultimately, this will allow us, in the cancer setting anyway, to start realistically thinking about cure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there's a lot to be optimistic about given all you said. I want to talk about Eikon Therapeutics a bit. It sounds like you came out of retirement to take the role at Eikon. And what were some of the things that attracted you to that role, Roy?
Yeah, well, I had the best job in the world at Merck. I just got too old to do it. And I retired, as I said, about 4 years ago. Coming up, going into retirement, I had no idea what I was going to do. I was considering potentially, or I was doing some board work. I was contemplating potentially some VC type work. And then Roger called me up, and I'd worked for Roger at Amgen and at Merck. And he told me about his new adventure with his startup company, Eikon Therapeutics. And as I listened to Roger describe it, I was completely mesmerized by the platform, which purposefully integrates science, engineering, artificial intelligence to open up really new vistas potentially for drug discovery. So we spoke a little, and Roger said, this platform is delivering at such a rate that I really do need to build a clinical capability. I wasn't sure I wanted another operating job, but Roger is incredibly
persuasive,
inspirational, and so I thought, gosh, well, let's try it again. So I enthusiastically signed up for a third tour of duty with Roger. This has been my fourth industry build or turnaround. And we've been actually able to prime the pump with few assets that we in-licensed as we waited for the platform to deliver assets, which it is doing now. And interestingly, many former colleagues and other drug developers with long industry tenure, after hearing and seeing what we were doing, have elected to join us. So we've built actually a meaningful capability very rapidly. And I will say that we're having a lot of fun. It's an exciting time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that is kind of inspirational, it's the sort of the virtuous circle concept. You have a new technology, you learn something new about biology, that leads to new drugs, new classes of targets, and that leads to further refinement of the technology. And so it becomes this virtuous circle. So it's really fun to see that playing out. And I'm excited about it and hope to see where it takes us.
It's an amazing company. We love working with your colleagues. It's great. We have obviously a small part in the work you're doing here at Diligent, but it's really just been a pleasure to be part of it. And I know you've given so much of your time today, Roy, and I appreciate it so much. I think we're closing in on time. I kind of just want to close by asking you, what are you still most curious about? What motivates you the most after being in this industry for so many years and doing so many amazing things?
Yeah. Well, I'm extremely curious as to how our platform will ultimately perform. I mentioned the virtuous circle, and I'm really excited to see how that plays out. I am very optimistic for the future of drug development and extremely motivated. The technology, our discovery platform, AI is a major enabler, understanding biology, diagnostics, improved trial design, trial validation, enhanced quantitative sciences, better understanding of regulatory policy. All of these, fill one with optimism for the future. And it's really such a privilege to be part of that journey. I think I've sort of come full circle in some ways in that I remain committed to bringing forward innovative medicines and treatment strategies. I remain excited at the prospect of continuing to try and do important work in medicine and just hopefully make a small change in the world for patients, if possible. There's nothing more gratifying than successfully getting an innovative medicine or treatment that improves outcomes across the finish line. It's
Absolutely.
It's clearly a highlight of one's life every time that happens.
Well, if this felt like almost like a master class, Roy, in how to build winning teams and launch transformational medicines. And I just can't thank you enough for spending time with me today. And I think the biggest thing that I'm taking away from this conversation is just your incredible dedication and this just unwavering commitment that you have to patients and making a difference. So thank you so much. Thank you for all you've done for the industry and for patients and for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's not a single act of heroism. This is a team sport, and you're only as good as the team around you.